Hello there, it's great to welcome you back to another edition of the Ezra File. And on this edition of the Ezra File, we're going back to a subject that we've touched on many these last few years. We're going to go back to the subject of science and the Christian faith. Science and religion, science and the Christian religion. We're going to look at the relationship between science and faith. As I say, it's a subject that we've covered many times on the Ezra File, and we've done it because it's an important issue for people today. I've been a vicar now for 20 odd years, and it almost doesn't matter what parish I'm in. People come to me and say, "Well, what can you say something about the relationship between science and Christianity? Can you say something about the relationship between science and the Bible or Christian thought?" It's an area that a lot of people struggle with because a lot of people have come to me over the years and said something like this to me. I say to my family, I say to my friends, whoever, I'm a Christian. I believe in Jesus, and my friends, they just pour scorn on it. They say, "Well, why do you believe such silly things like that? Science shows us the way. Science has only shown us the truth. Science has completely disproved the Bible. So therefore, what you're doing as a Christian is just it's silly. It's irrational." And that story, that way of looking at things, or that issue rather, has come back to me time and time again as a vicar. So it's an area, science and the Christian faith, that's an area that I'm always keen to tackle on the Ezra File. And what I think what this whole area shows us is, it shows us one of the some of the things that lie at the heart, rather, of our culture. We live in the West. We live in the technologically advanced Western world, and where we live, the culture that we live in, makes a series of distinctions. And one of the distinctions that it makes is a distinction between faith on the one hand and reason on the other hand. Faith and reason, they're two separate things. Faith's here, reason's there, and can you bring them together? No, you can't, because they're two completely separate things. Public and private, that will be another distinction that our culture makes. The distinction between the objective truth and subjective truth. Those are two different things. Actually, we're rapidly going down the line where the objective is being excluded altogether. We are rapidly going down the whole line of saying the only thing that's true is what's true in my experience, how I feel about something. But anyway, that's the distinction. Those are the distinctions that our culture makes. And this distinction between faith on the one hand and reason on the other hand lies behind this whole area that we're looking at, science and Christianity. And the reason why we're coming back to it today, well, it's an important area, I've said, in its own right, but the reason why we're coming back to it today is because of an article that I read in this journal here. It's called Theology. It's a journal. It's a journal, of theology. It's a journal of Anglican theology. I'm a vicar, so it's the kind of thing that I'm going to read. It's about 100 years old, this journal. Not this edition, but the journal is 100 years old. It's recently celebrated its centenary. It was founded within the liberal Catholic tradition of Anglicanism, which isn't really my way of doing things, not my tradition. It's not how I approach things. But I do read this because it keeps my thinking a little bit broader, keeps my reading a little bit broader than it otherwise might be. So this is the September-October edition of the journal, volume 23, 123, and number 5. So, and there's an article in it. Let me show you the article. It's by a guy called Ted Peters. There you go. Ted Peters. The article is The Temptation of Scientism. Ted Peters, a guy I do have a little bit of experience of. Back in the Stone Age, when I did an MA in theology, I remember drawing on a chapter in a book which was written by him for one of my essays. So I kind of knew him anyway. The Temptations of Scientism. And you can probably just about see there his first sentence, which says, "Science, yes. Scientism, no." Science and scientism, what's all this about? Well, science, what is science? Well, science basically is an attempt to build a body of knowledge based on observation, based on experimentation. And then you put your observations together to try and find some causal mechanism that will make sense of them. That's science. That's how it goes. And of course, it's been a very powerful understanding of the way that the world is for some 300 years, probably, something like that, maybe more. But anyway, scientism, well, it's an ism, it's an abstract noun, and it's a philosophy. Scientism is a philosophy. It says this, it says science is the only way to truth. The only truth is a scientific statement. That's scientism, and it's very popular. It's all around us. It's on the TV, it's in the media. A lot of journalists, TV presenters, people, and even people like Richard Dawkins, the sort of the talking heads that you see on television. That's where a lot of them come from. Scientism. The only truth is scientific statement, and everything else, anything else, any other claim to truth is at best secondary and probably completely irrelevant and worthless. Scientism. Problem with scientism, it's a philosophy, but it's not even a coherent philosophy. Consider the words. The only truth is a scientific statement. Those words themselves are not a scientific statement. The only truth is a scientific statement is not a scientific statement. So scientism, before it even gets going, cancels itself. The other thing to say is about scientism is that the relationship between faith and science is a good deal closer than a lot of people realize. And this is what Ted Peters' article is getting at. What Ted Peters' article is saying essentially is that both science and theology are faith-based pursuits of the truth. Science is a faith-based pursuit of the truth. That might sound shocking to a lot of people, but nevertheless, he is right. It is true. Why is it faith-based? It's faith-based because of this. The scientist has to have faith in two things. On the one hand, number one, he has to have faith in the rationality of the universe, that what exists out there, and my window's there, what exists out there is rational. It obeys rules that are consistent, that are reliable. The rationality of the universe. The second aspect, the second faith commitment of the scientist is that the rationality of the human brain can understand the rationality of the world outside. If that's the way that the human mind works, that's the way that the universe works, the scientist assumes the two can come together. And that faith, or rather, as Ted Peters calls it, that dual faith, he speaks of the dual faith of the scientist. That dual faith, as he says in here, trust in reason, page 363, trust in reason is extra scientific. The assumptions that science makes, that it relies on, cannot themselves be generated by science. Science is a faith-based pursuit of knowledge. So where do those faith commitments come from? Where did they get them from in the first place? Well, I'll come on to that in just a minute. But before we come to that, there's another thing. Ted Peters talks about the importance of rationality, the commitment of the scientist to the rationality of the universe. Actually, I would go further than that. I would say there's actually something else. I would actually say there's a third faith commitment that the scientist makes. The third faith commitment that the scientist makes is what's called the contingency of the universe. That the universe is contingent and not necessary. It's contingent. What do I mean by contingent? Well, I mean this, that the universe came into being as a free creation of a sovereign God. God created the universe any way he wanted, but he created this universe. He created this universe to work in the way that it does. So, if you want to understand what God has created, you have to look at it. If you want to understand what God has made, you have to stick your thermometer in it. You have to plunge a probe in it. You have to analyze it. You have to investigate it to see what is there. And the faith of the scientist is not just in the faith of reason, it's also faith in the contingency of the universe. And there's a guy who looked at this book. If you've been following the Ezra Files, we've looked at this book, Science and Christian Belief, written by John Polkinghorne. And John Polkinghorne makes this point very strongly about the contingency of the universe. He says this concept can be held to have played an important part in the ideological undergirding of modern science, for it implied both that the world was rational and that also the nature of its rationality depended on the choice of its creator, free creation of a sovereign God, so that one must look to see what actual form it had taken. If you want to understand it, you actually have to look, you have to experiment to see what's there. So the scientist has to have faith in the rationality of the universe, and the scientist has to have faith in the contingency of the universe, because that supplies him with the foundational commitment of science to experimentation. Without those two things, rationality and contingency, two faith commitments, science could not exist. So, why do we keep coming back to this? Why is this so important? Well, as I said, there is a pastoral reason why I come to this, because of the questions that people ask me. But also, I keep coming back to this time and time again because this is one of the reasons why I started the Ezra Files. Because my aim in starting the Ezra Files is to communicate the Christian faith, in today's world. And in today's world, we have to confront the issue that people who are brought up in our society see reason as one thing, faith as another thing, and under the influence of scientism, they see reason as a better guide to truth than faith. Faith in our society is at best a secondary way of understanding and probably meaningless. You might get something out of it, but really, compared to science, no. But that is completely wrong. As we have seen, it was Christian theology, the doctrine of creation, the creation of the world by a free and sovereign God. It was that belief that provided the intellectual framework which enabled science to be developed in the first place. It was Christian theology that provided the sea in which the fish of science could swim in the first place. And if you look at that historically, that is historically exactly what has happened. Where did modern science come from? Well, modern science has only arisen once. It arose in Western Europe towards the end of the 16th century and through the 17th century. It was able to do that because of the influence of Christian thought and Christian theology. And I have here a book that's by a guy, Francis Schaeffer, The Collected Works of Francis Schaeffer. If you're a long-term follower of the Exiles, if you're a long-term follower of the Ezra Files, you will recognize Francis Schaeffer because we've done an episode on him, which will be down there somewhere. And one of the things I found when I started to read Francis Schaeffer was the way that he was able to show that the birth of modern science was due to the influence of Christian theology. And this is what he says. This is a quotation from one of his books. He says here, what we have to realize is that early modern science was started by those who lived consensus and setting of Christianity. So page 225 of this one. Early modern science was started by those who lived in the consensus and setting of Christianity. A man like Robert Oppenheimer, the American physicist, a man like Oppenheimer, for example, who was not a Christian, nevertheless understood this. He said that Christianity was needed to give birth to modern science. Alfred North Whitehead, who's a philosopher, 20th century philosopher, A.N. Whitehead stressed the same thing. Christianity was necessary for the beginning of modern science for the simple reason that Christianity created a climate of thought which put men in a position to investigate the form of the universe. Christian theology provided the sea in which the fish of science could swim for the first time. The distinction our culture makes between reason that way, faith that way, science there, and theology there, it's completely the wrong way around. The two belong together, and without the influence of Christian theology, you would not have modern science today. Let's say, well, hang on, wait a minute, John, what about the Greeks? I thought they all came from, I thought developed science, didn't they? Well, yes, the Greeks and a number of other down the years made steps in that direction, but they were only steps. The Greeks discovered some foundational things about the universe, light travels in a straight line. That was a discovery of one of the Greek philosophers. But Greek thought, Greek culture could never develop modern science. Why? Because the Greeks operated in a dualism. They made a distinction between matter and mind. Matter was evil. Only mind was good. So therefore, for the Greeks, what counted more than anything else was abstract thought, abstract reason. You could maybe catch glimpses of those abstract things in the world around you, Plato's forms, you could catch glimpses of them, but it was speculative thought that was the most important thing. Investigating the world around you was doomed to failure because matter was imperfect. Matter was ultimately evil. So the Greeks could never have developed, no society, no culture that took on Greek forms of thinking could develop modern science. It is only when Christian thought comes to dominate that science becomes a possibility. So there you go. That's the issue that we've come back time and time again to in these Ezra files. The debt that science owes to Christian theology, that the culture in which we live that separates out faith from reason, religion from science, those are arbitrary distinctions. Actually, they belong together. Christianity, as a pursuit of the truth, is every bit as valid as science is. Science deals with the different thing to theology, but it is not superior to theology. In fact, without it, science itself could not have begun. And as you know, on the Ezra file, we like to do music. And we've got a bit of music that fits with this one as well. There you go. I just got this for Christmas. One of the foundational collections in my album collection, foundational records or albums in my collection, is Rush Permanent Waves, originally released in 1980, 40 years ago. And this is the 40th anniversary edition that was released in 2020. And there you go. There you see a guy with some flippers on. It looks a bit like David Gower to me. But anyway, I'm sure it's not David Gower. But it's a kind of a variation on the original album cover. And Permanent Waves, we have actually looked at this on the Ezra file before. The last song on the album called Natural Science. Natural Science is a song written, the lyrics were written by Neil Peart, sadly now deceased, and it deals with the issue of science in our culture. What would happen if we just became purely a scientific culture? If we just pursued science as a way of learning truth to the exclusion of everything else? What would that produce, says Neil Peart? Well, it would produce a society, a mechanistic society filled with cynical human beings, because you would have no grounds for truth, for meaning, for purpose. All you would have is just atoms and molecules and the forces that make them move. And Neil Peart in the song Natural Sciences says, actually, we need a framework. We need something beyond science. We need something that will make sense of science. Science, like nature, must also be tamed with a view towards its preservation. And he speaks of a state of integrity that we must find. We must find something that's bigger than science, that can provide things that science can't, that provides a context in which we can understand it properly. And of course, the only thing that can do that, the only context that that can happen in, is the context which gave birth to modern science in the first instance, the context of Christian theology. So there you go. If somebody gives you a hard time about being a Christian and the findings of science, just tell them that actually modern science is a faith-based pursuit of knowledge. Modern science owes a foundational debt to the influence of Christian theology, and see where you go from there. Be seeing you.